Hello, this lesson is an introduction to geometry, vocabulary, and symbols. We're going to look at some vocabulary that involves points, lines, planes, angles, and we're also going to learn how to name points, lines, planes, and angles. And we're going to do a few exercises. So let's start with the title of our lesson, which is Intro to Geometry, Vocabulary, and Symbols. Intro to Vocab and Symbols. Intro to Geometry, Vocab, and Symbols. And we're going to start with some vocabulary. We're going to start with point. Okay. So let's start with, what is the definition of a point? A point is a figure in geometry referred to as a dot with no size. And I could give you an example of this. So let's say we had something that looks like this. I will draw you a figure. Okay. We had point and then the letter B. It was a little dot and then the letter B. We would call this point B. Okay. Then we're going to move on to, what is a line? A line is a figure that is perfectly straight has no thickness and it extends forever in two directions. And I will give you an example of what a line looks like. I think you already know this, but here's my example. Okay, this is a line and it has 2 points on it. We will call those points A and B. Here's a point. And why don't we add another point? Let's say it's got a third point, C. And we'll also write this script letter M on the side here. Okay, so if I want to name that line, I could call it line M, that little scripty M. That's an N here, line M. Or I could call it CA with a line that has 2 arrows on top of it. Or I could call it AB with a line that has 2 arrows on top. The 2 arrows show that it's a line because lines go on forever in both directions. Or you could call it line BA or line AC or line CB. There's a bunch of different combinations. You would just choose 2 of those points on the line. Okay, let's go on to a segment. Okay, a line segment is part of a line that has 2 endpoints. The thing that makes a segment different from a line is that it doesn't go on forever in both directions. A segment has endpoints on both ends of the segment. So I will show you an example. Let's say we had, here's my example, something that looks like this. That is a line segment. It's different from a line because it has a point on either end. And we could say, why don't we make this a larger line segment? Okay, let's make this A, B, and point M here. We could name this line segment AM, or we could call it line segment MA. And notice on top of the 2 letters, there are no arrows on the top of this line here, on top of the two letters. That shows that it's a segment. It's different from a line that has two arrows on both ends. Look at the symbol there. Okay? Let's go on to array. Array is part of a line with an endpoint. Okay, so it's very much like if you were to put a segment and a line together, you would have array. And I will show you what that looks like. So here's an example of what array looks like. You have an endpoint, and you have that direction it goes on, the array goes on forever in the right direction. I'm going to put another point on the array so that we can name it. Let's have point O here, point S here, and we're going to call this array OS, or you could call it OS with the array symbol on top. Okay, it's just a line here with an arrow on one end, and the first letter that you name has to be the name of the endpoint. So it has to start OS. You cannot have, it's not array SO. And that's not the correct way to name this array. Okay, let's talk about planes. So I'm going to scroll down. Okay. A plane is a figure that is a flat surface which extends forever in all directions. I like to compare a plane to a piece of paper. It's not a perfect example, but it's pretty close. The only problem with a piece of paper is that paper does not extend forever in all directions. But imagine that you have a sheet of paper. It's perfectly flat, and imagine that the piece of paper extends forever in all directions. I'm going to draw a picture of this. Usually, in geometry, they represent planes with a parallelogram like this, and typically there's a scripty letter in the corner, like this is P here, script P, or some other letter, and then sometimes there's points or lines or rays inside of the plane or on the plane. I'm going to call this plane ABC. And then there's a point, Q, that is not on the plane. Okay, so I'm going to say that I could call it plane scripty P. Okay, so plane P, or I could call it plane ABC, or CAB, or just choose three letters that are in the plane. Okay, and then I have two more vocabulary terms that we would like to discuss. One of them is angle. Okay, an angle is a figure formed when two rays share a common endpoint. Okay, and the last definition, I'm not going to show you an example of an angle right now. We'll go back to angles. Congruent is a very, very, very important term. This is when figures have the same size and shape. And there's a symbol for that, and it's very important. I will draw that. Here's the symbol. Okay? It's an equal sign with a squiggle on top like that. And congruent means you've got the same exact shape. It means they are exactly the same. So let's look at some examples of the vocabulary terminology that we just discussed. So example 1 says, use the figure for the following exercises. And over here we have plane R. We're going to name a point. Part A says name a point. I see point T, point U, point V, point A. Why don't we just say this is point A? That's one answer. There's many answers. Okay, how about a segment? I see segment TU, segment UV, OR, OM, MO. There's lots of them. I see segment TU. And remember, here's TU. TU is the two letters, the two endpoints, and then I have a straight line on top of TU with no arrows to indicate that it's a segment. How about a line? Let me erase this. How about a line? Do you see any lines? I see one. Okay, I see line N, or I could call it line MO, OR. I could call it MR, RM. I'm going to name this line MO. And because it's a line, it should have two arrows on the ends. How about part D? It says name array. Okay, I see a few rays. I see UV starting at U and going forever in that direction, or TV, T, and going forever in that direction. So I'm going to say I see ray TV, and remember it has a ray symbol on top. It's a straight line with an arrow on one side. And then the last question is name a plane. I could name this plane, looks like a script ER, or I could call it plane TUV. There's a zillion different ways to name this, plane TUV. Okay, let's answer a few more questions. Let's look at these notes. It says, and we're going to talk about angles. An angle can be named by its vertex, by a given number. You see how these have numbers on the angles, or by three letters with the vertex as the middle letter. Okay, so we're going to look at some examples of this. The vertex is this point that joins two rays together. That's how you form an angle. So example 2 says, name the angles in 4 different ways. We'll start with, how about we name it by its vertex? I see A is the vertex, so I could call this angle A. You see this little symbol here? It almost looks like a less than symbol, but it's flat on the bottom. This, I could call it angle A, since that's the vertex. This is also a 1 here. I could call it angle 1. Or I could name it by the 3 letters that are shown here at the points with the vertex in the middle. So I could call it angle FAP. Notice A, the vertex, is the middle letter. Or angle, you could reverse those, PAF. That's the 4 ways that I can name this particular angle. Okay? Look at letter B here. I could name it by its vertex. That's angle T. I could name this angle by its number, angle 2. I could name it by 3 letters. T has to be the middle letter, angle XTE. What is the other way? Same thing, just in reverse, angle ETX. So that's how you name an angle, and that's an extremely important concept in geometry. If you do not pay attention to the way that angles are named today, a lot of the things that we talk about in geometry, you will not understand what's happening. You'll feel like you're behind. This says if you want to describe the number of degrees, if you want to describe the number of degrees of an angle, use the symbol, the measure of, okay? Measure of angle. So this is a lowercase m with an angle symbol, and then you would put the name of the angle here. So the measure of angle 1 or the measure of angle ETX. Okay, so we're going to use what I just wrote there, that measure of angle. We're going to use that for the following example. Example 3 says, describe the number of degrees in the following angle using an equation. Okay, so I see that this is angle Q. The measure of angle Q, this is an equation, so it should have an equal sign, is equal to how many degrees? 63 degrees. Let's write this in a different way. Okay, so how else could I name this angle? You could name it using 3 letters. Angle SQM is equal to 63 degrees. Or yet another way, you could call it the measure of angle MQS is equal to 63 degrees. The sum of the interior angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. I have a feeling you may have heard that before. And we're going to use this information to answer the following question. Example 4 says, write an equation to describe the sum of the interior angles in this triangle. Okay, so I have the measure of angle 1 here. This is an interior angle. Here's 1. Here's 2. They all add up to 180 degrees. Here's 3. These angle measures add up to 180 degrees. The measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 3, this is an equation, is equal to how many degrees? We just wrote it down. 180 degrees, because this is a triangle. So those are the examples that we were going to look at today as an introduction to geometry. We would also like to look at a practice example. So let's start with example 1 down here, this practice question. This would be a very good time for you to pause the video and try this question on your own. I'm going to go ahead and answer it. Question 1 says, what is another name for angle 1? I have several ways I can name this. I cannot name it angle S, and the reason why is because I see 3 different angle S's, and that's very confusing. So angle S will not work. That is not a correct answer. I could call it, here's angle 1, okay? I could call it MSZ, angle MSZ, or the reverse, angle ZSM. ZSM. It helps if you mark the angle with your pencil. Okay? And then on practice 2, it says name the figures below. The first one has 2 endpoints, so I know that's a segment, and this is segment TY with a line on top, no arrows because it's a segment. Okay? Or segment YT with a line on top. 2 ways I could name this. And then letter B says name the figure, and I see point N and point O. I could name this NO, and it's line NO. Or I could name it ON. And remember, the line should have arrows on the ends because it's a line and not a segment. And then there's one other way, which I did not mention before. I could use the word line and call it line NO or line ON. Any of those would work. That's the end of our lesson. Thank you very much for watching.